Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee, our tour guide, historian, and tonight teller of tales about chicanery in north-central B.C.
Yep. And Mike, there are four major components to this particular story. And the four major components are the Union Bank of Canada, which was an old and early bank. Secondly, gold and silver coin and bills and so on. Thirdly, a piece of high-grade silver. And fourthly, a Colt 45.
That sounds to me like there's violence afoot and robbery.
High drama in the upper Skeena River country, Mike, around a place called New Hazelton. And I think the key figure, obviously the key figure in this drama, is a very unlikely individual. He's a Presbyterian minister. He's called Jock McQueen, Donald Redmond McLean. And he's the archetypical Westerner. He's tall, he's lean, he's a good speaker, he's an excellent athlete, and surprisingly, he's a crack shot, an expert marksman.
And who are the nefarious crew in this deal?
Well, McLean is opposed to one set of individuals who had a predilection for violence, and they're called the Russian Gang.
This sounds just like a great story. The Russian Gang, Donald MacLean, New Hazelton, right after we come back from this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee telling the story of New Hazelton and the Russian Gang. First of all, tell us a little bit about where we're going. What's special about this country?
Well, Mike, it's an area we really haven't touched on very much before, and I think it's one of the most attractive areas of British Columbia. We're talking about the Upper Skeena and the Bulkley River area.
The terrace country?
Yeah, in New Hazelton, Old Hazelton Terrace and so on. And this particular photograph gives us an indicator of what this country looks like. That's Rocher de Boule, that mountain in the background. The Bulkley River coming right into the Skeena River. And, of course, New Hazelton and Old Hazelton are about 3 or 4 miles apart.
Are they in this shot? That little buildings on the left is what?
That's right. That's New Hazelton.
And on the right is Old Hazelton. Okay.
Okay. And rather interesting in that there were many attractions in this country. First of all, it was Hudson's Bay Company, and there were hard rock silver mines and hard rock gold mines, both on Rocher de Boule. And of course, I think the most famous mine in the whole area was the Silver Standard mine. And this particular shot indicates the Silver Standard as it looked just about the turn of the century. And there are other mines too. Rocher de Boule. Here's the tramway coming down from Rocher de Boule, coming right down into and carrying the ore from Rocher de Boule right down into that company down there.
And they were pounding ore down there.
Well, sure they were.
By a ton load.
Sure. And the result was Old Hazelton was a significant town on that Upper Skeena. And at that particular time, before 1912, they had pack trains coming into the town, and they had stern wheelers, and this is a shot of one of the pack trains coming down.
Would this be old BX-style pack train? Or?
Yeah, but probably Jean-Claude Cataline was the individual there, you see.
Cataline?
Yeah, Cataline, the famous packer of the North, Mike. And, of course, the pack trains gave way eventually to the real trains. The Grand Trunk Pacific came in, and this next photograph shows you the Grand Trunk Pacific.
Those are the goofiest-looking locomotives I've ever seen. There must be, what, 1, 2, 3, 6 of them there?
Yeah, about 6 of them. They're little work locomotives, and the Indians have come down to see what they look like, because they've never seen a train before in that Upper Skeena country. And, of course, the result was the train went on the other side, and that gave rise to New Hazelton. So now we have 2 towns with the same name, Old Hazelton and New Hazelton. And this particular shot shows New Hazelton just as it's getting underway, probably about 1911, 1912, Mike. And the next shot shows New Hazelton in 1913, okay? And so now it's becoming a town of some importance on the Upper Skeena.
I see there's even a gaming club there.
Sure there is.
You know, for billiards and things. So there's an establishment. About how many people here now?
Oh, probably 500 or 600 at that time, maybe a little more. Fluctuating population, a lot of people coming in town and out of town, Mike, all the time.
A lot of money changing hands.
Well, sure.
Silver's worth something.
Yep.
Which leads us to this Union Bank of Canada checkbook. What a wonderful little artifact this is.
Yeah, it's a great artifact, Mike. And, of course, in a town like that, they had to have a bank, and the bank was the Union Bank. Now, this attracts all sorts of strange individuals, and now we come to the Russian Gang. Now, we have to look back a little bit, 1 or 2 years on the Russian Gang, Mike. And Tsar Nicholas in 1913, we think, exiled a group of 6 individuals from Siberia. Now, they were already exiled to Siberia. He doesn't even want them in Siberia. They're so violent.
There's that.
So they leave Siberia on pain of death. And they're led by a guy called the Pockmarked Man, okay, Zakharov Bekukarov. He was a very strange individual. And he's the leader of the gang. And they somehow come into Canada. And they begin, and of course they're broke. They haven't any money, so they begin looking around. And they spot New Hazelton. Well, New Hazelton is made to order. There's a bank on the main street, and this particular photograph shows the old bank on the main street probably in 1913, when the Russian gang arrives. And they look around. There's no lawman in New Hazelton. There is an old Hazelton, but not New Hazelton. So they break into the bank, all 6 of them, and they hold up the teller, and they escape with a magnificent sum of $16,000. This is payroll for the construction workers.
That's obviously a major haul.
Well, sure.
A major robbery in British Columbia's history, right
You
there.
multiply by 40, Mike, and you come to over $500,000. And of course, they escape, and they go over, they take the only route out, when the only route out is over this particular bridge, the Egowit Bridge.
That is the flimsiest looking contraption I've ever seen.
Yeah, put together by rubber bands and string and everything else pretty well, Mike. And it was probably the most famous of the early bridges in British Columbia. In fact, it was so daunting to people that some people went across on their hands and knees, and I can't blame them.
I can't blame them either.
And the gang probably ran across it. And what they do, they thread their way down through the interior of British Columbia without being discovered, Mike. They cross over the boundary line, and they go into Washington State. And in early 1914, actually in January of 1914, they come into a little mining town called Granite Falls. They hold up the bank there. They get $1,500. They disappears. Nobody finds them. A couple of months later, in March, they cross over back into British Columbia, and they go into Abbotsford. This place, they hold up bank there for $4,500. Their take is getting better. They're getting pretty proficient at it. And finally, they jump back into Washington State, just over the line again, a little place called Alma, and they take $5,000. It's now March 1914. And then the Pockmarked Man gets together with his gang. We surmise this is what happens. Well, where's our best hit been? Well, the best hit is New Hazelton. There's no policeman there. So they decided to make a return trip to New Hazelton. This is a fatal flaw, because they go back up through the interior trough again, all the way back up to New Hazelton. They arrive there in early April of 1914, Mike. And this is a shot of, inside shot of the Union Bank of Canada in New Hazelton at about 1914. This is how it looks, Mike. It's a bank constructed of logs on the outside. On the inside, a lot of slats. Not much, really. It's not
It doesn't look very secure to me. It's all wood, sort of.
Yeah, it is. It's a rather easy pickings for a good gang who know what they're doing.
Okay, into this environment come 6 desperados.
Come 6 desperados who want to make another hit in a town that they knocked over once already about 6 months before. And this is a nice April day. It's April the 7th, 1914. Beautiful in that country. And down the street at that particular juncture, unfortunately for them...
For them being the bad guys.
That's the Russian gang, comes the Reverend Donald MacLean. And as he comes down the street, he hears a couple of shots. He stops. That's unusual, even for New Hazelton. And up the street runs the bank manager, Tatchell, a guy called Tatchell. He stops MacLean. He says, there's a holdup in the bank. MacLean puts down his bucket, turns around, heads back in a dead run to his house, which is only a few hundred yards up the street, runs in the door, tells his wife he wants his guns. She gives him a Lee Enfield rifle. She handles a Colt 45 to Tatchell, the bank manager, and they both run out the door. As they run down the street, outside the bank is the guard.
There's a lookout for the bad guys.
That's right. He's the lookout man. He's armed with a Winchester, lever-action Winchester. And he fires some shots towards Tatchell and MacLean. Now, MacLean, he has a choice. He can duck behind a building like Tatchell, the bank manager, does, or in front of him, about 40 or 50 feet away, is a big pile of ore. And this ore is from the Silver Standard Mine, Mike. Yeah. And it's a marvelous bulwark, really, because they piled it there to attract investors. Well, it's ideal for the Reverend MacLean. He makes a run for the ore, slides down behind the ore pile, and now the gun battle starts in earnest, because the guy outside the bank, it's his job to keep MacLean pinned down. He's unable to do this. He fires a couple of shots at MacLean. They ricochet off this ore. MacLean looks over, draws a bead on him, downs him with one shot through the heart. Okay. So the lookout man is gone. He's lying on the sidewalk, his rifle by his side. They hear the commotion inside the bank, the other 5 robbers. One of them comes outside, grabs the rifle, turns towards MacLean. MacLean shoots him through both hips. He's down. The rifle is down. The others come out. They're armed with Colts and Remington revolvers, which really aren't that good at that distance, Mike. They start firing a fusillade of shots at MacLean. He replies. He wounds the third man. He kills the fourth man. He wounds the fifth outlaw, and the sixth he doesn't wound. The sixth man, the pockmarked man, makes his escape.
Now, these photographs that you have here, this portrays the carnage, so these photographs were taken obviously by a very astute photographer of the time, and they must have gone all across the country.
Well, sure. You notice the only photograph he didn't take was of the gun battles. He was hiding behind a building somewhere.
He was keeping
But
his head down.
as soon as the smoke is cleared, he comes out, and he's right there. Now, I got these particular photographs. At least they were originally picked up by a guy called Wiggs O'Neill, who was well known in that country. An old historian in that country passed away some years ago. And what it shows here are the two bandits lying on the sidewalk, right there, dead. They've been dead for a considerable length of time. In fact, you see a doctor's bag here, Mike, and so they're the two that die immediately. Now, the next photograph is kind of interesting. The locals are standing around. They're looking at the two bandits, two of the bandits who were wounded. One of these men dies. He was the one who was shot through the hip. So that's the third one that was killed.
They're off to be given some sort of
some
treatment
medical
at this
attention, probably at Old Hazelton, okay? And now, the other two that are still vertical or semi-vertical is a guy called Kaliev, and he looks almost, well, relieved.
Pleased not to be dead.
That's right. He's glad he's not facing the good reverend. And he gets 20 years, Mike. This guy gets 20 years in the penitentiary. So that's another one of the Russian gang gone. And this is a guy called Manyukov, and he's been wounded, so they bring a bench up for him, and they let him sit down there, and he looks a little stunned. And
Yeah.
I think after facing that volley of shots from the Reverend MacLean, I think he would be a little stunned indeed. And now this is a very
interesting shot.
Very interesting shot. There's the first bandit to fall, and that was the guard of the lookout man. And I believe that this is the Reverend MacLean around 1914, Mike. And you can see he has kind of an unusual look on his face.
He looks happy. That's a strange kind of thing. Is that just an aberration, or was he, in the rough and tumble times, would it have been reasonable to say, I did good work, even if you were a Presbyterian minister?
Yeah, even if you were a Presbyterian minister, he doesn't look as though he's too unhappy about bringing down the bandits and causing the imminent destruction of the Russian gang.
That looks like a giant guy. I mean, that photograph really portrays him as a huge brute.
Oh,
and,
yeah, sure.
And this shot, too, with all the townspeople around.
Yeah, they're milling about. This is probably about an hour after the carnage has taken place. And, of course, you know, about 600 shots were fired in the battle. I think most of those were fired after the battle. I think the Reverend MacLean probably only fired his 8 or 9 shots and made everyone count. And everyone else really admitted that MacLean did all the damage, that Tatchell didn't do much, and the other people who were supposedly firing after the fact really didn't do much. It was a shootout between MacLean and the Russian gang.
And they were not accurate with any of their bullets. The Russian gang just sort of filled the ore pile with lead.
Well, sure.
Slightly reduced the assay, I guess.
Yeah.
You could think of it that way.
Very true.
Now, there's this neat shot, too, of the old bank, and
Yeah.
It looks pretty well shot up.
Yeah, it is. This is, there are about 5 shots had gone through the window of the bank, and evidently they picked a whole bunch of shots, a whole bunch of lead out of the bank itself. And so that's probably where they got the figure of 600 from, Mike.
Now, this sixth guy, the pockmarked man, escapes.
Yeah, the pockmarked man, he escapes, and he weaves his way down through the interior of British Columbia again. And he lays low, Mike, for about 6 months, but it is not the end of the pockmarked man.
Okay. Take a break here. Be back in just a second as this magnificent tale continues on Gold Trails Don't Go Away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns, the story of the Russian gang and its lone survivor, the pockmarked man, now heading back to the United States.
Yeah, Zachat Bekirazov goes back into the United States, and we think he lays low for about 6 months, Mike, but actually he isn't. He is not completely idle. What he is doing is putting together another gang. Even though the first Russian gang has virtually been wiped out by this one-man army, by MacLean, he still figures that this is the best way to make a living in North America. So he goes back into the United States, and we don't hear much of him until October the 17th of the same year. So that's just about 6 months later. And he goes into a little town just south of the line called Sedro-Woolley. And there are 4 others with him now. He's almost regained the numbers that he had in his gang before. They come into the little bank in Sedro-Woolley, only one bank, and they start shooting wildly around. They wound 2 individuals. A kid is killed by a stray shot. It's a real frontier holdup, Mike. And they force, and of course the clerk in the bank at the time and the manager realize these guys are dead serious. They force them at gunpoint to open the treasure box. And they extract everything in the treasure box, which is $12,000. So that's a considerable take, Mike.
I'm amazed, you know, we're talking 1914 here,
Sure.
not the 1880s
right.
or something. This is gunplay
Sure.
this century.
That's right.
Okay, 12 grand.
Yeah, so 12 grand, mostly in gold, Mike. Now, that's interesting. And some bills and some silver, but mostly in gold. And we do know that these guys had money belts on them, on the inside. And the leader took the most of it, and then they split it 4 other ways equally. I think the leader got about half. But anyway, they don't escape that area because of posses put out in this particular... The posses were combing the area, but they lay low for about 3 days. And finally, on the 17th of October, 1914, a Canadian customs man and a Canadian and a Great Northern agent and another agent in there were sitting down and having coffee in a cafe early in the morning, around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And in bursts a sheriff, a deputy sheriff guy called Ed Wells. And the Canadian officer's, customs officer's name is Cliff Adams. And he says, I think somebody's trying to cross over the line getting into Canada on the railroad track. So Adams, he's armed, the GNR agent is armed, and the sheriff is armed. And they all head off towards the crossing, the natural crossing between Hall Prairie Road and the Great Northern Line.
Blaine, where Blaine would be right now.
Sure, very close to Blaine, very close to Blaine. In fact, they were having coffee in Blaine at the time, Mike. So they head up there, and it's still early morning, so there's half light. But they have flashlights with them, okay? And they see a flicker off to the left-hand side of the tracks. And the American law officer points over there, and he says, come out of there. Well, he's answered by a volley of shots. The first shot knocks the gun right out of the Great Northern agent's hand, and after a volley of shots have been exchanged, Adams is killed, shot through the heart, and then the American law officer decides to withdraw rather with, I think it was a very good idea. And he gets up a posse, and about an hour later they start following up the track. They find one of the individuals dead, and the individual they find dead is the pockmarked man, okay? And up the track they find another individual dead. So that's 2 of them gone, but the other 3 have vanished. And finally, about a week later, I think it was October the 24th, 1914, they have every crossing into British Columbia guarded, and guarded extremely well. They're very serious about these guys. These guys have committed mayhem all over British Columbia and northern Washington State, and there have been a number of deaths, including their own. So they have all the trestles and all the bridges walked, all the railway lines, and these are the natural entries into British Columbia, through the Great Northern, mostly through the Great Northern, Mike. And on October the 24th, way off in eastern British Columbia, and this is hundreds of miles away from the scene of the original robberies, hundreds of miles away from Blaine. They had a searchlight set up on a trestle out of Fernie, BC, which went across the American line. And so anyway, they had some guards there, and early in the morning, just about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, they hear somebody walking across the bridge. They happen to have their searchlight. They throw on the floodlight and the searchlight, and 2 armed men are caught in the blaze of this light, and they start shooting at the searchlight. Well, that's no go at all, because there were 4 or 5 guards there. They fill them with lead. Behind them is a 3rd man. So they rush out. They pick up the bodies of these 3 guys. They look at them. They each have $1,544 strapped to their bodies in money belts, and that means that the last man of this particular gang, the 5th man of the Russian gang, escapes. He has $6,000. Now, strangely enough, the pockmarked man is dead. All the other members of the gang are dead or serving 20 years in the penitentiary, but the 6th man does disappear. We don't know where he went, Mike. He simply vanishes off the face of this earth.
What a remarkable story. Well, I mean, this is, and the distances they're traveling in 1914, how would they make it, for example, from Cedro Woolley up to New Hazelton? Would they ride horseback? Would they take the bus? Would it be the car, the train? How would they?
I think they walked most of the way. There's no evidence in any of the detail we have and any of the background material that they actually were riding. And they probably weren't, because remember, their background had been Imperial Russia. Probably were not used to horses like the Westerners were. And so they walked most of that way. I think when they got from Blaine all the way over to Fernie, I think they took the Great Northern over there. They probably hitched a ride in the Great Northern.
And what about this guy, MacLean, this reverend? Now, we kind of surmised that a smile on his face was kind of an unfortunate thing to have happened. What happened to him after this event?
Well, he's an interesting study, Mike, and I think the study is this, is that I think on a reflection, he was a minister. He was a Presbyterian minister, and he was serious. And I think his initial reaction to that battle, which it really was in New Hazelton, was just that. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and I think he later regretted it, because he eventually moved down to Quesnel in that Caribou country, became a very well-known veterinarian, and was principal of the school there. And evidently, from people who knew him, such as the Orstons and so on, he didn't really discuss that particular episode in his background. So I think that the Reverend MacLean, who was probably quite an intelligent man from all reports we get, regretted that particular moment. I think he might have chosen another route if he had to choose another route. So
now, there's a story about threats against his life. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I mean, right after the robbery took place in 1914 on April the 7th, somebody came back with a very heavy accent looking for the Reverend MacLean. And he asked all around New Hazelton, Mike, and people began to suspect, because the man had a heavy accent, didn't sound normal, it sounded almost like a Russian accent, so they sent one or two guards, accompanying him everywhere he walked around New Hazelton.
This is the foreigner, the strange person?
And eventually, after 3 or 4 days, he decided to leave New Hazelton. They escorted him right to the train, put him on the train, and he went right into Prince Rupert, with guard, by the way. There he was interrogated by the police. We don't know whether that was the pockmarked man or not.
Or the survivor, or who it might have been.
Yeah.
Now, the fact that this gang is called the Russian gang, and exiled by Tsar Nicholas from Russia, do we know anything about where they might have entered, or other banks they might have knocked over?
Well, I think they probably came over on ship, Mike. I think certainly they came over on ship, and then probably landed. I think they probably landed at Prince Rupert and made their way inland east from Prince Rupert.
That's a fascinating story, and it must have traveled around the world.
Oh, sure it did. Yeah. One of the great gunfights of the Old West is not well known, not even in British Columbia.
But it must have. Did it have any residual effect of drawing police or something to this area? Because in 1914, beginning of the First World War, a civilized province, you just can't have this kind of thing going on.
Yeah, I think they actually did station one of the police officers, British Columbia Provincial Police, in New Hazelton right after that. A little bit after the fact, Mike.
The Russian gang, Reverend Jock McQueen, shootouts at the American border and in north central B.C. Just a fascinating story. And that's Gold Trails and Ghost Towns for today. Who knows what we'll come up with next time? Join us then for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Bye-bye.